Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Ryu, a graduate student at Aura Research Group in University of Victoria. Sorry. Today, I'm going to present about Docker. I'm sure most of you have heard about that and feel very familiar with it. So do I, but I'm only used it as following some instructions when I need it. So this time I'd like to look into it. Here's today's content. First, I will introduce about Docker briefly, and then I'm going to look into the details. Docker is an open source project that uses OS level virtualization to deliver software in packages called containers. Docker is based on Linux containers, as known as LXC, but now it has moved away from LXC dependency. Docker provides for people to package an application and its dependencies in a virtual container. We can use Docker on Linux and Windows and Mac OS. Docker can package Windows application too, like Windows container too, but here I'm going to deal with only Linux container. And Docker requires over than equal to Linux kernel 2.6.32 or CentOS 6.5. Docker isolates software from its environment, so it works uniformly despite of different environments, which means containerized software always runs the same regardless of the interface infrastructure. Because the application is isolated from the host's infrastructure, if the software is attacked, it is hard to affect to host's infrastructure. Of course, there are some issues about that. I will deal with it a bit later. Anyway, until now, Docker looks very similar with virtual machines. Unlike virtual machines, Docker is much lighter because it does not virtualize OS and it relies on host's Linux kernel. Nowadays, practically Docker is considered as a standard for virtual container service. Comparing Docker and virtual machine, they have similar resource isolation. However, virtual machine is an abstraction of physical hardware turning one server into many servers, and hypervisor allows multiple virtual machines. So each virtual machine must have a full copy of an OS, its application, and necessary binaries and libraries. Therefore, typically, each virtual machine takes up copious amount of gigabytes, and they are slow to boot. Unlike virtual machines, Docker is an abstraction of an app layer, which means it packages code and dependencies together. Multiple containers can run on the same machine and share the OS kernel with other containers. Each container is running as isolated processes in user space. So sometimes, for a Windows user like me, the combination of VM and Docker brings dramatic effect. And more effectively, each container only takes up megabytes, and it is more portable and efficient than VM. And comparing LXC and Docker, LXC uses an initialization system that can manage multiple processes, so entire applications run as one. As I mentioned before, at the beginning, Docker was based on LXC, but now it has moved away from LXC. Docker's applications are broken down into their separate processes. And Docker provides modularity, which means it does not need to take down the whole application. Instead, it focuses on the ability to take down a part of an application to update or repair. A single Docker image consists of a series of layers, and each layer is created when the image changes. So Docker reuses these layers to build new containers, which accelerate the build process. As intermediate chains are shared among images and saved as built-in changelog, it is easy to manage version control, and it is possible to roll back. And most of all, there's no need to take effort and overhead for setting up for new application, like buying new hardware, running provisions, and then making them available. For example, let's see how many steps to install GitLab. In Ubuntu and CentOS, we have to set some environment and install other dependencies first. GitLab looks having quite simple dependencies, but if you need a various environment for developing something, then Docker would be the best option for that. Because sometimes the environment variables or paths can be entangled, then it will be hardly to restore and consumes lots of your time. So if you use Docker, then in any Linux system, we can use GitLab by only using this one command line. Yeah, it looks very long, but it's one line. Yeah. And there are some advantages. There are some disadvantages of Docker. If we use lots of container, then it is hard to manage and orchestrate them. Then the grouping the container will be needed. And secondly, we cannot use the same Unix-like functionality such as syslog process. And sometimes we have to manage cleaning up process ourselves, such as after terminating child process, then we have to clean up grandchild processes. And lastly, about security. Docker can access other Linux subsystems and devices that are not named space, such as SE Linux or C groups and dev/SD devices. And some of Docker features requires root privilege such as Docker daemon. So the host can be attacked. And this is what I prepared for this presentation, and these are some references. Thank you for giving your attention. Is there any question?
I can ask a question if no one has any. I'm curious if you happen to know, and maybe you might not, but you mentioned that originally Docker was based on LXC, and then over time they moved away from that. I'm just curious if you happen to know why it was that they moved away from LXC, and do you know what sort of library that they're using underneath? Is it some kind of custom thing used by Docker, or have they moved to some other popular containerization library?
Uh, 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 I saw that some architecture about that, but I didn't look into deeply. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. I just was asking in case you might happen to know. was just interesting that because LXC is quite a popular library. So if they moved away from it, presumably they had some good reason for doing that. I was just curious if you might happen to know what it was.
Okay, sorry. Thank you.
I want to ask a question. Is there a significant performance loss for Docker compared to the native operating system?
Mm, in my sense, actually, I didn't notice about the different performance about the between Docker and my when I used my host infrastructure, but maybe there's some difference at there. Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, I believe that the Docker can use almost full hosted hosted resources, but maybe there's some limitation about that. So yeah.
So the Docker is running based on Linux, and the Mac OS is running on Unix. So to running Docker on Mac OS, so it has to use a Linux layer. Am I right? It has to use a Linux layer to support to running Docker on Mac OS.
Oh yeah, maybe yeah. Actually, I have no idea about Mac OS, but there when you use the Docker in Mac OS, you have to use Mac OS VM. So maybe yeah, that's right.
Oh, I get it.
Yeah.
Oh, I get it. Windows can use WS. So basically, when you're using Windows, the Docker is running on the native kernel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry. Can I ask a question about the interaction between the environments inside the Docker and outside the Docker? Because when I work at my work terms last term, and they use Docker a lot, and for me sometimes the problem is that even though it's more of a virtualized environment, I sometimes, for example, will need to fetch some code or fetch some libraries outside the Docker, which is a bit of a trouble since I don't directly manage Docker, so I only call the provided scripts that there is. So, for example, if I want to use if I want to find some source code outside the Docker in my program, how can I do that? For example, when I try to do some sort of debug.
Usually, yeah. Usually, when I use Docker on Linux, I usually put my sources on the security on the dev under the SD devices. Yeah. So yeah.
Is that the recommended approach? Because when I had that trouble, I have somebody else fix that for me. They use some kind of soft linking, and so that they can find specific repositories out outside the Docker and
Oh, yeah, soft linking is one of your option, but actually those oh sorry. Those security issues occurs from servers. So if you're not really using and operating some servers, then I think it doesn't matter.
okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions, or is that everything?
I have no more questions.
Yeah, that's basically what I can think of for now.
Okay, well, that's good. Well, we had a few questions for the speaker, which is good. So Young-Soo, thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, thank
It's
you.
been a while since
Thank
someone
you.
has given a presentation, so we appreciate it. And I'll stop the